Once around the pot, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Indeed it is. It is showtime, ready to go for On the Ledger Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford, and we're recording this a little earlier in the week than normal. It's Wednesday, October the 29th, so some things may change by the time you hear this, but likely one thing that won't change is all the grief and fret around the trade story, so we'll get to that today. And we're still talking about that ad that featured Ronald Reagan and what the effects are on the overall trade relationship with the United States. Of course, some new legislation being introduced, and with some cases, a little or no debate. So we'll get to that. And I think we have to spend some time talking about what is at least an alarming report this week from Daily Bread Food Bank. They released their annual Who's Hungry report. The numbers are staggering. So we'll feature a conversation with Neil Hetherington, but we'll also get the take from our panelists today. John Wright is here. He is the CEO at Canada Pulse Insights. And Kathleen Wynne, former Premier of Ontario, and Keith Leslie joining us. You see and hear him on CH Television in Hamilton. And our other partner in crime, Tim Hudak, has decided that he would prefer to sit in the dentist chair this morning rather than around the round table. So I'm not quite sure what that says about present company, but Tim will be back with us next week. Again, one of the things that just keeps percolating to the top, John Wright, is this the sort of acrimonious nature of the Canada-U.S. relationship vis-a-vis trade. Last week, just after we'd finished recording, Trump dropped the bomb that he was going to cancel all of trade talks with Canada because of the Ronald Reagan ad that the Ford government had released in the United States. This week, just yesterday and today, we're still talking about it as whether or not it is had any effect, or was the contributing factor alone in terms of where the trade situation comes in. Brian Lilly reporting about the F-bombs and threats and the breakdown of the Canada-U.S. relationships. Fife was on the story as well. The American ambassador to Canada delivered an expletive-filled dressing down to Ontario's representative in Washington during a prestigious event in Ottawa on Monday, according to two sources who said the tirade focused on the anti-tariff ad commissioned by the province. As dramatic as all that is, I think this too will pass, John.
Yeah, because the president is mercurial and vindictive, and things will change. The prime minister and the president were actually sitting across from each other at dinner last night and raised glasses and smiled. So who knows where this is going to go. I'm glad we've had a little bit of time between the dropping of the ad and where we are today. Because, I don't make any bones about this. I'm much more akin to taking things quietly rather than out in the open and poking the bear. On the other hand, I think what the other trend that is happening amongst the chattering classes right now is the question as to whether or not the federal government itself has a strategy and whether or not it is actually working. So we're getting ready for the British Columbia Premier to wade in with their own ads on softwood lumber. But let me say this, that in terms of just the pure politics of it, while there are many who will either be on side or off side with this premier and whether or not the ad was right or not, or the timing was right or not, or whether the president was just looking for an excuse, all those set aside, the premier has a big constituency to look after. He's got autos, he's got now lumber, he's got other aspects of the economy. And he's known for being Captain Canada. I mean, nothing has changed in that stripe since day one on this. So he can't simply sit on the sidelines. And secondly, if we were hearing what the federal government is actually doing, I mean, we get hints that things were close. Maybe they were, maybe they won't. We have the heads of our two countries sitting across from each other, clinking glasses, looking at each other, smiling. I don't know what's going on, and I think there's a sense that this may be drifting anyways. So I'm glad we've had some space in it. As I said, I'm more one to not poke the bear, but you take a look at this and say, well, other premiers are probably stepping up as well. We may have changes in our relationship with China on EV, canola, and other products. And that's been prompted by Scott Moe out in Saskatchewan. So maybe it was the right thing to do, but I think it also lays bare the question as to whether or not there is a cognitive and true strategy for the federal government on this.
Well, at the same time, I think, Premier Wynne, the question becomes whether or not, there should have been any objection from Ottawa on what the Ontario government was up to. There seems to be all this fury in Ottawa on Parliament Hill about, well, what did the Prime Minister know and when did he know it about this ad? And I'm thinking, if you had been the Premier of the province at the time and you decided that you were going to fire off an ad over Trump's bow, I'm not sure that you would have been looking for the blessing of Ottawa. Now, I might be wrong on that.
Well, yeah, I'm going to push back on that a little bit, Dave, because I was in that chair in 2016, and I understand it's not the same situation, but my position throughout that period was that we needed to work in coordination with the federal government, that there needed to be the right hand and the left hand needed to know what was happening. And, we talk often about this good cop, bad cop, and there's been a lot of that conversation in relation to this ad, which I like the ad. I think it's a good, it was a good strategy to put that, or a good tactic to put that ad out. But my concern is that if it was not part of the overall strategy, if it wasn't coordinated with the federal government, and I don't know the degree to which it was. The Premier says that the Prime Minister knew, that he'd seen it, but I don't know whether he saw the ad a few minutes before or whether it was part of a conversation and they agreed that this is something that should be done, because that's what should be happening. And so I know David Eby's going to go out with these softwood lumber ads. I hope that the officials in the federal government and the officials in all the provincial governments are having a conversation about that overall strategy, because if not, and people are taken by surprise, then that can derail that overall strategy. It can derail whatever the conversations are. And I don't know the degree to which that actually happened. John, to your point about we should know more, and I've heard a lot of this in the kind of narrative about, we should know more about what Mark Carney's doing. Well, maybe, except that negotiations that are done in public usually are not the real negotiations. I mean, Keith knows that, we were involved in lots of negotiations at Queen's Park, whether it was with teachers or other organizations. And you just can't do that negotiation in public. It doesn't work. We didn't do negotiation in public the first time around when Trump was there. So I think we have to be a bit careful about how much criticism we throw at the federal government for not being open about what's going on at those tables. We're not going to know until much closer to the time when there actually is a deal.
Well, and we'll come back to that, Keith. I want to touch on that just in terms of the overall, 100,000 foot view of the strategy. But we're already talking about Premier Eby's strategy and tactic around his ad campaign. It's not like Doug Ford, this was a brand new thing. He started this back in the spring in terms of inundating the U.S. media with all of the pro-Ontario ads, anti-tariff ads, all the dangers of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And even when he made the announcement official, was it the 16th of October, there were still rumblings before that. So surely somebody on Parliament Hill said to the Prime Minister, hey, you might want to pay attention to this.
I would imagine that Ontario did indeed show the ad to the Prime Minister's office, whether Prime Minister Carney himself saw it. But it's one of those ads I would look at and it was being shown and go, that's something that both levels of government can get behind. Let's look back. Remember, way back 8-9 days ago when Trump first lured the ad, he said he probably would have run it as well. It took him another couple of days and some phone calls apparently from some auto sector CEOs that were threatened with lawsuits by Canada for leaving town. And all of a sudden by Thursday, he's all of us, going to shut down and cancel all negotiations with Canada. All trade talks are off immediately because of this ad that 2 days before he said he would have run. I think, though, even though the ad was effective and Premier Ford is correct that he got, an awful lot of views of this ad, you got people talking on both sides of the border. But I think it was a mistake to then run it during the World Series after Trump had canceled all the negotiations. Then we end up with the extra 10%. I worried after running it again in Sunday's game that we might have got even more than the 10% tariff. So it was clearly a mistake to poke the bear the second time and run those ads in the World Series. But overall, I think they were effective. But, as the Prime Minister said, he's trying to make it look very much like this was the sole reason. This ad, Ford's behavior was the sole reason that the talks were canceled. And, when he said, why would you think that? He said, well, take Trump at his word.
Well, let me ask you this then, and you already brought up the Stellantis piece, and Brian Lilly includes this in his story, that in fact, Stellantis goes knocking on the door at the White House saying, look at what's happened here. These guys have just slapped us with, more tariffs, and they're going to sue us. And the implication being that pissed the president off enough to actually prompt this. On the other hand, I mean, I can turn that coin around and say, listen, your tariffs are a fucking disaster. Let's clean this up now because we can't afford any of this. So that conversation could have gone either way. It's not necessarily saying, help me, daddy, I'm in trouble. It's, get your act together. Could have easily has been the conversation.
It was a typically passive-aggressive Canadian thing, wasn't it? Using Ronald Reagan's words in the ad. And he's the godfather of the Republican Party, the modern Republican Party. And to show him, to show Trump is offside with Reagan on such a fundamental thing that, Trump has made tariffs his favorite word, his major policy of his second term. And here we have Reagan offside with it. So he, came up with some basic lies that we had edited it. We had, falsely represented what was said by Reagan. And it actually created that debate in the United States where most American news outlets came back and said, no. They used the words exactly as Ronald Reagan said them. They edited them for length and time, but that was it. So I think that was very effective overall. But to Premier Wynne's point, we can't have 13 provincial and territorial leaders going off and firing off their own media campaigns in the height of these negotiations, especially now that we're at such a fragile point. They've stalled again. I think the Prime Minister has to talk with the premiers about the national strategy, but anything they're going to do, including Premier EVs on softwood lumber, they have to work with the feds on this. It has to be a coordinated approach, or else the Americans will just easily pick us off one by one and play us against each other.
John,
and
one
Dave,
of the things.
Can I just jump in on the Stellantis thing? Because it is beyond me why there aren't more companies doing that second option that you outlined. I mean, the only explanation is they're just as afraid of Trump as everybody is. Everybody's tiptoeing around because he's so mercurial, he's so unpredictable. And, I think the overarching issue about this is if it wasn't the ad, it could have been something else. Who knows what it was going to be that was going to make him wake up on, that morning and say, we're gonna do this to Canada. So, but I think there is a fundamental question about when companies and the people who really see the damage that's being done by his policies in the States are going to find their spine and are going to stand up and say, you're killing us here. And that just hasn't happened yet.
Well, John, we've said before, in terms of the degree to which the Americans are even aware of what's going on here, just not beyond the political class. But the media is really starting to pick up on this. I saw, I don't know, in my feed, there must have been a half a dozen podcasts I subscribed to that they led with this story and seriously led with this story. And one that really strikes me, and I really enjoy the show, it's Pivot with Kara Swisher and Scott Galway. And I thought Scott Galway just nailed it.
I think Canada's never looked stronger. It's just strange to be rooting for the Blue Jays when they're playing my home team, the Dodgers. The U.S.'s strategy looks performative, faux masculinity, sclerotic. They're dictating trade policy off of commercials that antagonize the president. Canada just looks more consistent and unafraid. I think this has bolstered the brand of Canada.
The awareness of this, vis-a-vis elbows up from the Americans' perspective, is what's probably more important than it is from our own side of the border.
Dave, I don't know whether any of what he just said matters. I mean, you're dealing with a president who decided to just demolish an entire wing of the White House, and no one, could lift a finger to it. He decided he would try and impose 10% more tariffs on a country at whim, which he hasn't done because, it could be perhaps used against him in the Supreme Court challenges. Look, we're dealing with a country that is changing before our eyes. It is becoming an autocratic, very centered, personality-driven country. Where we would have, never have imagined before this year that mass guards would be just taking people off the street and taking them away. I mean, 260,000 people have been taken off the street exactly like that and put somewhere where most people don't know. It is a very different country. And as a result, the rules and how you play are different than they would have been a year ago or in other settings. So I don't know how you play this, because it can be day in and day out. And it doesn't matter whether we look like we're better or not in terms of this negotiating situation. All I would say is, yes, I agree that we don't want to negotiate in public. That's the old rules, and maybe the new rules are different. But what I do see now are at least 4 premiers: Scott Moe, Danielle Smith, Doug Ford, David Eby, who are out freelancing on their own. Not so much with Danielle Smith lately, because she's got, a pipeline she wants to get in shipments going. But when I see that there is no coordination, what I read into that is that premiers may be frustrated with what's going on at the table, if anything, and saying, look, I've got constituencies I've got to look after. I can't let my own political skin wilt in the sunlight. I've got to do what I've got to do. So I don't know where Canada's at, but when I see freelancing going on, and especially after the Prime Minister has said at numerous gatherings of them, we're all on the same page, we're working together, I think there's a problem. And I don't think it's just communication. It may be that there is no there at the end of the day, because it's so mercurial with this president.
Well, I would admit that the lack of conversation outwardly by the Prime Minister to say, even make an effort to appear to be updating us where we are in these situations, but there's no there. So it just leaves us all open to saying, well, this could be happening. This is the problem that we're facing. We're in a bit of a fog, and that creates a level of anxiety just generally across the board. It doesn't matter, what political side of the aisle you're on.
Well, I think that was, I was going to say, I think that was Premier Ford's frustration. I keep hearing deals are close, but nothing happens. And then I hear deals are close in steel, aluminum, energy, not auto. So you can't blame Ford. He's got to defend that auto sector. And I think not hearing any real progress is what, especially on this. And he's right. We have been hearing deals close, even though deadlines are passed and forgotten about. He's got a point.
Yeah, but there's another part too that I think about in all of this. And that is the Prime Minister himself, in terms of how he deals with a lot of these issues. He called there was a speech given last week, which was supposed to give hints or an outline of where the budget was going. And it was a nothing burger. Like, it just dropped solidly. The only people who were enthusiastic were the students who attended and were members of the Liberal Party. There are circumstances now happening where the Prime Minister's off allegedly and, getting deals done that may help Canada over the next decade. And God bless him for doing so, because we are trying to pivot and make those arrangements possible for our own country to be out from underneath the thumb of the United States. But he has a habit of not communicating a lot of things. And the question in my mind now is, well, is this how he's treating the premiers, where people are basically saying it's pretty good lip service, but I've got to make my own bed to lay in, and this is what I have to do.
Yeah, I think you're right. If the auto sector, that is the one area that if Ford is not hearing that the auto sector is being protected, or that it's on that it's in the conversation, then yeah. For Ontario, that's just untenable. So I hope you guys are wrong, that I hope there is conversation going on. I hope that there is a strategy there. But yeah, if there's not, it's a real problem.
Well, and as we said off the top, by the time you hear this, things may have changed. So it's just
by the time we finish, things may have changed.
Well, that's how it worked last week, there we were scrambling. Okay, having said all of that, and that's happening over there right now in the legislature, there are a number of pieces of legislation that have been introduced, everything from fixed date election rules being changed, donation limits. We got the speed cams in there. There's a little bit in there about interprovincial trade and labor issues. And I think one of the things that popped up recently is there's little or no committee debate on some of these bills. And I think that, the excuse is there's a sense of urgency. We really need to get this done. But, Kathleen Wynne, it would have been less urgent if we hadn't not been in the House for 137 days.
Yeah, no kidding. And what's urgent about canceling speed cameras when it's actually a program that works and saves lives? So, this whole process is taking a page out of the Mike Harris years. I remember when I was, in the legislature, being thrown out of the legislature, protesting Mike Harris. One of the things that we were really concerned about was there was very little committee work. The committees didn't travel. And so there was very little public input into the debate. And as the term went on, there was less and less. So when we were elected in 2003, that was one of the things that we really wanted to do. And I was particularly exercised about this because I had been on the outside trying to get my voice heard. Anyway, I think this is a problem, but I think it's absolutely consistent with who this government is. They really don't want public input. They don't want a lot of debate about these issues. And yeah, they've left it late. So to get the hours of debate in before the Christmas break is a real challenge. But had they come back according to the legislative calendar in September, they would have had a lot more time to debate these things. But, make no mistake, a lot of these things are bright, shiny objects. They are, the speed cameras, the taking control of education by the minister. These are not part of a coherent vision for this province. These are populist ideas that speak to a certain segment of the population that supports Ford. These are not things that are well thought out and are designed to, because they're based in evidence, deal with urgent problems in our society. They are political moves, and that's what this government does, particularly now that, they don't have COVID to deal with. They're into a different phase, much more like the first 2 years of the Ford government term. And so it doesn't surprise me at all that this is all political all the time. They don't want input. They want to do these things and do them with impunity.
Let me suggest that part of the problem is the whole nature of an omnibus bill, because a lot of this is kind of all rolled into one big, huge, fat piece of legislation that has so many worms in the can. I mean, it would be all. Keith, you have seen your share of these things where, unless you spend like an entire week, day in and day out reading, you're liable to miss something that's important in there, or it's easily buried even in the conversation.
That's the whole intent.
Right. I agree. So, I mean, I bring it back to Kathleen Wynne. Should we not, do away with omnibus bills? Wouldn't that help solve some of this problem? At least we would be having individual pieces of legislation on individual issues and important issues, and then we can have a conversation about individually. It's easy to swamp it when everything's in the can.
Oh, absolutely. It's easy to distract from something major if you're going to talk about speed cameras in a bill that has nothing else to do with speed cameras, but you can roll it into that, and all of a sudden that becomes the headline, not what you're really trying to accomplish. The omnibus bills are really meant to distract. I mean, let's face it, they can hide, they can bury things inside there, and they know that the media has only so much of an attention span, only so much time they can dig into these files, and so that's why they do them. I mean, to me, the scariest thing that came out this week was the government, after 19 and a half weeks out of the legislature saying that they have to ram these bills through and have no committee hearings or minutes of committee hearings at best, was the, getting rid of what he called, what Premier Ford called the fake liberal law with a fixed election date. That did not come as much of a surprise, given that he ignored it earlier this year to take advantage of the Trump administration's threats and have an early election and get reelected with even more votes than he had in the first two terms. Speaking of which, also in there, he's maintaining the per vote subsidy for electors. That's not something the parties that the PC party used to have as part of their platform. They wanted to get rid of it. Now it's a key thing because they get more votes than anybody else, so they're getting more of a subsidy than anybody else. At the same time, they also increased the donation limit, the personal donation limit to political parties by 47% to $5,000 in the middle of a skills development fund funding scandal where they're basically accused of paying out money to party supporters and donors and friends and insiders. And here they are at the middle of doing that, increasing the amount of donations that can be made as part of their pay-for-play political patronage system that just really, really stinks to high heaven at some points.
So, Kathleen Wynne, let me come back to you on the omnibus bill. Should it be something that we just totally do away with? I don't know how we would do it, but I mean,
yeah, I don't know how you would do it either. But look, if you give people enough time to dig through the omnibus bill and have a debate and have committee hearings about it, then you can pull it apart. You know, sometimes you need to group some stuff together that doesn't actually go together. I get that. But the problem here is not taking the time to give people the opportunity to actually examine the thing. So, anyway, my concern with all of these pieces of legislation pretty much is that they are advantaging the government in every situation. So whether it's increasing the donation limit, because when you're in government, it's easier to raise money. So it's easier to raise money and you up the donation limit, you're going to get more money. I think keeping the subsidy in place is a good thing, particularly for the opposition parties. I think it's actually fair. But in terms of fixed election dates, for example, that gives the government of the day an advantage. If you think about 2002, 2003, Keith, you'll remember week after week, we didn't know when the election was going to come. Ernie Eves was dancing around it. And, it just was a waste of time and focus. There was very little work being done in that year and a half because everybody was waiting for when an election was going to come. What fixed election dates have done, even though when there's a minority government, the government can fall and then the date can change. But at least it gave some certainty in terms of when the election was going to come and not putting it in the hands of the government so that they can do it when it's to their advantage. So Dave, maybe getting rid of omnibus bills would be a good idea, but I still think that any government, if they want to cut short debate, if they want to obscure what's actually going on, they'll find a way to do it. If they want open dialogue and they want people to be involved, then they'll find a way to allow that.
John, the whole thing around everything we've talked about so far is I don't hear anybody in my part of the world screaming about we need to get rid of fixed election dates or increase donors or even the speed cabs. As much and all as the irony is, there's been no debate. There's been plenty of debate on the speed cabs in the last 2 months, just not in the legislature or at Queen's Park. But these do not seem to be the pressing issues that, I'm sure you're finding in your polling in terms of what are the things that matter to people in Toronto, Ontario, and in fact, across the country.
Well, that may be true. But if I reach back into my political consciousness, my first encounter in the legislature was with the Bill Davis government in 1980-81. When I was a parliamentary intern. And I went through that election campaign and watched them come back with a big majority. And the first thing they did was shut down the committee hearings. There was I was writing my paper on the Administration of Justice Committee around the Astor Trust Raymore scandal that had taken place. And it was like absolutely shut down immediately. So if I then pitch forward, I can't think outside of Bob Rae's government where the social contract came in, which was the biggest piece and had the greatest opposition. I can't think of another government that hasn't used omnibus legislation, whether it's for energy or whether it's for slipping through a whole range of things. I mean, this is the stuff of majority governments. Secondly, you're talking about a premier who has, in some polls, 52% support across the province. So an enormous amount of capital, who's deciding to do, what he wants to do and what the party wants to do with really no opposition in any way, shape, or form. I mean, that it takes about 37% to get a majority government in the province, but he's dealing with half the public who is saying, yeah, I'm on side with you. And the third thing to your point, most of this stuff, like no one would know what an omnibus is, even when we talk about it, most of this stuff is not going to have any resonance amongst people, although The rental piece that was supposed to be part of the omnibus apparently is being beaten back. And there may be some other provisions that are there, but I don't see any difference from majority governments at federal and provincial levels over the last many decades that don't do this sort of stuff where they pack things and move them forward. So I think right now you have to judge it by how much political capital he does have and the ability to do this. I don't think people are paying attention to it because you're right. It's more about what food's on the table than it is about speed cameras. But the reality is, even in the polling that I've just done in the city of Toronto, he still has a whack of support there that's greater than what he did in the last election campaign. And part of it may be free trade, but the other part is people are more concentrated on other issues than what's in a bill, and none of the public is going to go through with a fine-tooth comb.
That's all true. And John, I think the argument you're making is that he's getting the politics right of this. And I think that's true.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that in the last election, we had a coherent outline of a platform that this government was going to act on, and they were going to come in and they were going to do it. In which case, having an omnibus bill with a bunch of things that had been in the platform kind of makes some sense, maybe. But we didn't have that in that. I was knocking on doors in that winter election that he just won, and nobody really knew what he was running on. He was running on his Captain Canada cape. So I think when all these things start bubbling up, like speed cameras, like changing the rules around education, like the legislation on landlords' rights, and I know that's being pushed back. But these are all things that are a surprise, and whether people understand at this moment what the impact of them is going to be or not, John, there's going to be an impact of all of these things, even if we just look at speed cameras, people are going to speed up. They're going to be driving faster. And so that there will be an impact. But, the banning of them speaks to a kind of iconoclastic, we're going to just get rid of all this government interference. And it satisfies for him, I think, it looks like, some need to look like he's doing something and the government's doing something, but not part of a coherent plan. And I would argue the very case you're making, that it's not what people are concerned about. These issues are not speaking to the things that people, that are really affecting people's lives and will make a huge difference in the long term. Even though people may be able to remember them, it's easy to remember that speed cameras have been banned. But what does that do in terms of, your training programs, the fact that colleges and universities are dying on the vine, they are struggling to, make ends meet and provide programs for kids. Well, that's a long-term problem. That's not a short-term problem.
Well, I'm sorry that Tim's not in the room, because I know I heard him talking about this on the radio vis-a-vis the whole idea of, consultation around the committees. And he's a little concerned about the lack of public hearings and the debate. But, I just come back to, before we move on, John, just come back to you on this and say, isn't that just low-hanging fruit for the Ford government? They've got a majority. Even if it's performative, wouldn't it have made sense to say, okay, we're going to have 3 weeks of committee hearings and just do it?
Well, yeah, they could do that. But let me come back to something Premier Wynne said, and I would agree. And we have agreed, even with our guests on this and with Tim in the room. If you look back over now, 3 terms, we're into the 3rd term, nothing has really changed. This is not a government that spells out big sweeping visions of the future on almost any file. This is a retail politician who is sitting in the premier's chair, who goes the way he does, which without consequence, seemingly in the public domain. He's getting 52% support across the province in some of these things. He's using the political capital that he has. But more importantly, it's never been a hallmark of Doug Ford from the campaign trail get-go in the first campaign to actually say, this is the 3 pillars that I have. We're going to move towards it. However, on the street, you can pretty well name what he's for. Putting money in people's pockets, sticking up for the little guy, making sure that there's no red tape. He is practicing retail, but to have an expectation that this government is suddenly going to change and he's going to change and say, oh, we're going to bring in the sweeping vision. That's for other premiers. This one is doing it one way, and it happens to be working. And people, the majority of them, seem to be fine. It's not to say that the chickens won't come home to roost, right? Like,
Yeah,
I'm
the
all with
next
that.
government, when the government comes in, there's going to be a lot of cleanup to do, John. A lot.
Well, there may be there depending upon the political stripe. It's always been the mantra that there's lots to clean up. We're
Well,
even seeing it amongst the Liberal Party federally, cleaning up after Justin Trudeau. So let's, you know what, it may be a full 5-year term before we get a chance to have that consultation with the public again.
Before we move on, Dave, I just want to talk about the corrected misstep. I thought it was a huge misstep by Premier Ford. You talk about all his populist moves to go after renters, to say that basically after 12 months of your lease, instead of going on month by month indefinitely, the landlord could get you out of there basically for business reasons. In other words, if he can get more rent, you're out. Holy cow. I mean, look at the people that would be affected by that the most. Long-term renters, lifelong renters. My parents were lifelong renters.
yeah.
What age would they have been when they were thrown out of their apartment that they were renting or the house they were renting? What age are we going to? It's just so seemingly harmful at a time when there's such a housing crisis going on, and when they're not building the houses they said they would build, and they're not anywhere near their goals of building the long-term care beds they said they would build. They're talking about taking away the rights of renters to just stay in their home beyond a 12-month contract. I couldn't believe how quickly they brought that in out of nowhere. That was part of anybody's campaign, but they were very quick to say, okay, we're not going to have the consultations and that we're backing off. I hope by saying they're not having the consultations, they're not just going to push it through without consultations, but that they backed off the whole idea completely. And I'm taking them at their word.
Keith, I don't think Ford had any idea that that's what that legislation would have done. And I think when he found out, he said, well, we're not doing that, you know, and to his credit, he said, we're not going to do it. But he should have known. He should have known what the impact of that was going to be. He would have staff who would have known, and there certainly would have been bureaucrats who would have known what that was going to do, and he should have known ahead of time. Anyway.
Well, on that note, it's a good segue because I managed to catch up with Neil Hetherington this week. And as we mentioned off the top, Neil is the CEO at Daily Bread Food Bank, and his team released their Who's Hungry report from 2025. And to say the least, there are some alarming numbers in here, and it's going to get, we talk about, you know, the trade situation going to get worse before it gets better. It's going to be a whole lot worse on the poverty front and the food security front before it gets any better. Food bank visits in Toronto have now reached an all-time high of 4.1 million. That's more than 500,000 more than a year before, and a 340% increase since the pandemic. Now, we're going to get into that number in a second, but just before we do, just a few more things that come out of that report. More than 1 in 10 Torontonians now relying on a food bank. The most worrisome number in there for me is that 25% of the clients are kids. 35% of employed clients hold more than one job. So, you know, we have often talked about the working poor. Well, that's pretty much how it's defined. Median monthly income of food bank clients, $1,200. The median monthly expenses for the clients, $1,300. You know how that math works out. Here to talk about it, Neil Hetherington is the CEO at Daily Bread Food Bank. And, you know, Neil, all the work to move the needle and the good work that you guys have been doing year over year, and it seems the only needle that is moving is showing that things are just getting worse.
Yeah, sadly, that's true. You know, I always try to look for the hopeful items within the report. There aren't a lot, but I'll give you two. The first one, our growth rate declined. So it went up by 18%, which is staggering and atrocious. But that's actually down from the year prior, where the growth rate was 36%. So we're not growing, but not at an extraordinary, like at the rate we were growing at. It's still an awful number, 18%, considering the population of Toronto's actually decreasing. So that's, you know, one little bit of, you know, very slim silver lining. But the other one, I think, it has more sort of legs to it in terms of being hopeful. In the report, we talk about who's coming to the food banks. And what we're not seeing is growth rates among seniors. It's growing, but not at a significant rate. And so it's about 10% of the folks that come to the food bank. And so you look to the cause for that, and it's around the supports that we offer people who are 65 and older. There is CPP, there is the guaranteed income supplement. So it gives me hope that if we choose to enact policies that deal with poverty, that we can have some success. So those are two very lightly colored silver linings.
Yeah, and okay, so I'll throw the wrinkle back at you though. When you look at the age groups and the demographics, almost 7 in 10 are working age. These are people who are
Yeah.
between the ages of 18 and 64. And you and I have talked about this endlessly about how that demographic, from a policy perspective, is overlooked and, well, I'll dare say,
Mhm.
ignored
Yep.
by government in terms of the supports you talk about. And this brings us back to the efficacy of guaranteed incomes and all of those sorts of things. To me, at this stage of the game, we are at such an urgency that I can't understand why we're still nibbling around the edges on a policy basis.
You're right. The fastest growing segment, 18 to 44. So even within there, people who are working, 60% have a post-secondary education. They did everything right. They went to school, they got a job, they're working hard, and they still can't make ends meet. And so why are we nibbling around the edges? I think that it's complex. From a political perspective, we shouldn't be helping them. They can get a job. You got that kind of viewpoint out there. And it is difficult to formulate policies for individuals that do have the equivalency of full-time hours, uh, but they're doing it by cobbling 2 or 3 jobs together, and therefore not having benefits, and therefore not being able to make ends meet, and they're having to make tough decisions between rent and prescription medications, things like that. So it's really hard and complex policies, but I think you can start to tackle it with fixing EI. That is an outdated system. It does not work for so many of the people that we see day in and day out who are contractors working for Uber, and maybe they have one other sort of service related job, and as a result have no benefits.
So square this circle for me, because when we talk about the demographics and we say, like almost 60% of them are single adults who are clients at the food bank. And then we've got two parent or guardians, 13%, and single parents, guardians at 11%. So that 24% or whatever it is with, the parents involved, that suggests to me that kids are incredibly overrepresented in these numbers. If we're talking about 25% of all the users are children.
Yeah, so doing the math is going to be very difficult. You and I are recording this the day after an 18-inning Blue Jays loss. So, but what I'll say on the children's side of things, it's troubling that we're at 25%. That's lower than the Food Banks Canada report, which is about 33%. And I believe with all of my heart that it's underrepresented at 25%. Think about it. You're a single parent, and we ask you questions like, "Does your child get enough food to eat?" Now you're put into a predicament of answering honestly, or facing criticism or perceived criticism that you can't manage your income or don't have enough income to be able to feed your child. Maybe you're worried about CAS getting involved. And so I do think that there is an underrepresentation of people answering that question fulsomely, particularly when we dive in deeper and we start to ask questions about, do you miss a meal? Does your child miss a meal? How often does your child miss a meal because of income? Those types of questions, I think people are going to be light with detail.
Okay, and there's always the call to action. What gives you any hope, consideration, thought, optimism that this next wave of please help now vis-a-vis government and policy is really going to cut through. I mean, with everything else that's going on in the world, you guys seem to be pushed off to the side of the table again.
Well, this report and other research that Daily Bread has brought up has been in the House of Commons on a regular basis over the last 2 weeks. So that gives me hope that at least at that, at the federal level, folks are talking about it. I have hope with Build Canada Homes and Annabalo distributing $13 billion for capital in capital to develop affordable housing. Now that we'll see benefits of that in 5 to 7 years at best. And so I'm hopeful that there will be, but I'm nervous that on November 4th, that there will be investments in rent supplements, which will have an immediate effect on food bank lineups. I do have hope that the Canada Disability Benefit will, people have had 4 months of that. I expect we'll do a study in 6 months' time to answer the question: did it have an effect? Was the frequency of individuals on disability coming to the food bank starting to decrease? So I have hope there. I have no doubt that provincially the government wants to improve things, but I think is only tackling it from the supply side. And all of the legislation seems to be around, and the ideas around developing more rental units. But it was a paltry 14,000 last year, when we know we need hundreds of thousands of units developed, and they're not prepared, in my mind, to get into the game of having building what we used to do, with building cooperative and building social housing. And if we want a Canada, if we want a province where everybody thrives, there are individuals who do need the marketplace on its own when it comes to rental won't be able to solve that.
Well, if you want to jump on the bandwagon and help with the advocacy here and push some buttons on Parliament Hill at Queen's Park, at City Hall, wherever it happens to be, I would direct you to the website at dailybread.ca. Neil Hetherington is the CEO at Daily Bread. Thanks for all the good work you do, my friend.
Thanks very much, Dave. Go Jays.
So when we hear from Neil, we look at this, John, 4 million visits, 25% of the clients are kids. And, if you hear him right and you do the math on this, it actually appears as though there's an increased number of clients who might have to take time off of one of their 2 or 3 jobs to make a visit 2 or 3 times a month to the food bank. And I think they make this point in the report. This isn't about personal choices. This is about policy choices. And there's no excuse for not acting to turn this ship around.
Yeah, well, yeah, we don't want people to go hungry, and we certainly don't want families to go hungry. But I look at the detailed elements of that report. I'm always the data guy, right? I'm going to go in and take a look at this. 34% of that group have been in this country less than 10 years. 70% of them are single individuals. I don't see the crosstabs on foreign students. I mean, we let in 1 million one year and 990,000 the next from the federal government, and frankly, most of them don't leave. And so I'm not sounding the alarm bell that we have this group of organic people who are suddenly in need of food because of the economy. Like it may be whole sections of the population who have come here and who in fact can't get food. 70% are single. Most of them aren't making money. I don't know what that says. If I were doing a survey, I'd be cross-tabbing it by whether they're students, and some of this may exist. But I don't think I'm convinced totally that this is everybody out there, and the evidence appears to show it, who's suffering from this. And it may be, in fact, a third of them who are newcomers to this country, who are mainly single, who might be a lot of students. And that's what's giving rise to this. So I don't want to say that this isn't important, because it is. And we've had discussions about having guaranteed income for people and disability issues and income that can cause problems. But I'd sure like to have seen more data in this, if you're going to be surveying those people who are going to the food banks and being able to cross-tab it and get a really good profile of the people. And frankly, I didn't see that in this report. I've just been able to evidence what I just said.
Yeah, and I wouldn't be surprised if Neil has gotten to that level of detail and granular, numbers in terms of who's coming and going, because I know they've got a pretty good profile. And sadly, Kathleen Wynne, they've got a lot of data to draw upon and based on their years of experience there. But even what John's talking about, what are the contributing factors? It all comes down to policy decisions, whether it's immigration, whether it's housing, homelessness, how we deal with shelters, how we deal with folks who are, suffering from mental health and addiction issues.
Yeah, minimum wage, our rates, because so many of the people who are coming, I can't remember the number, but are already working. These are people who are working. They're not people who are without work. Well, they are, John. They're people. I mean, you're shaking your head, but these are people going to the food bank because they can't make ends meet, and they are working minimum wage jobs or more than one minimum wage job, right? And whoever they are, and I agree, John, that they're the segmentation of who they are. Maybe that's not totally clear, but whoever they are, what is it? There's been a 340% increase since 2019 of people going to the food bank. So whoever they are, that's a real problem for our society, that there are that many people who can't feed themselves. So, those policy decisions, as Dave says, they all have an impact. We did have in this province a basic income pilot. And one of the things I said when we put the basic income pilot in place was, yes, this is about people living in deep poverty. There's intergenerational poverty. There are people without housing. It's all about that. But it's also about figuring out as technology takes over, as the economy changes, how do we help people make a transition that's more rational? And we're facing that not necessarily just because of technology, although that's part of it, but because of the economic changes that Trump has been a catalyst for. So, how are we going to deal with the change that's coming in terms of the ability of people to be employed in this province? What if the auto sector really does start to tank? We're already losing jobs. Ask people in Windsor, it's already starting to tank. What are we prepared to do to help support people through that transition? I don't think we have a good answer to that, either at the federal or the provincial level. And I think that Neil Hetherington's stats on the food bank are a bit of a warning sign that we're actually not prepared to deal with either the entrenched deep poverty issues that we have in this society or the more ephemeral ones that are caused by a change in the economy. I think it's a really important warning flag.
I know you want to jump in, John, but just want to get Keith in here because to Kathleen Wynne's point, we did the series, the 2030 Project, and we talked about the need to reduce poverty and eliminate poverty, et cetera. And overwhelmingly, those numbers of visits to the food bank should be considered as key economic indicators. Exactly. And there are people who are looking at it and say, those are real numbers. They're not lagging numbers. They're happening right now. And it speaks to the state of our economy and the state of our social supports, et cetera.
Well, it all comes down to, in a great many of these cases, as we talked about, they're not getting a livable wage. And they're trying to work, 2 or 3 part-time jobs. Even if they're getting a decent hourly rate, they're not getting enough hours to get by on. So they have to work somewhere else. They have to travel a lot to get these jobs. Some sort of help. I think there needs to be some sort of recognition that a minimum wage does not apply across Ontario, that Toronto's minimum wage absolutely needs to be different. If you expect your employees to live in that city, and if you don't expect them to live in the city, then you need to provide them with transportation costs. You cover their transit fees, something like this. I think the government has to help out in ways that, if people aren't making a livable wage, we're allowing technology to not improve us our job opportunities. We're allowing people to become Uber drivers, for God's sakes, or skip the dishes. They're not making it going from a non-livable wage to unsustainable at all. So we've made things worse with the technology. We've allowed jobs to become even lower paid with no security whatsoever. I think those things need to be addressed on a policy front. And that would help people get, as I say, to an actual living wage where they could actually work and afford to feed their family. And no one, we're not talking about people coasting on the system. There's always going to be some taking advantage of the system. People lining up at food banks are not there for the fun of it or for the free food. They're there because they cannot afford to eat.
But, again, I want to embrace the notion that everybody should have food to eat and that this is an issue that we have to address. But Keith, to your point, 70% of the people, and this is the statistics in this report, are single. Okay? They're making, I think Neil said, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, roughly $1,200 a month. Yeah. Working a number of different jobs. I mean, okay, we do have issues that go beyond simply, the economy that are affecting people. It might be other, as I said, I don't know exactly the drill down on this sort of stuff, but I will say this. I've just finished doing a series of polls and releasing them across this country, done for City News at Rogers. And what we did was a repeat of the work that we did last year, and that was look at situations in Vancouver and the metropolitan area there, Edmonton, Calgary, Toronto, and the GTA. And the most recent report is on immigration. And the most surprising thing that came out of me, and then I had to think about it, was only a third of the people in each one of those cities, in some less, basically said, you know what, we're not getting enough money from the federal government. But the rest of them seem to believe that, half of them in those cities said, yeah, we're getting enough. And the other part said we're getting too much, if you can believe it, roughly a quarter. What it speaks to is a sense that there's not enough coordination between the governments to deal with this. I mean, we're not putting together the management structure. And people believe that you just can't throw money at things. You've got to coordinate the responses from the municipal level right up to the federal government level. So again, I think this is a really complicated issue to look at if we're not dealing with a whole series of facts out in the open. And I don't want to see people go hungry, but I think there's a scrutiny here that people want before, they buy into the proposition that this is a major crisis amongst most people across this country.
And yet we have government policy to give, Galen Weston and Loblaws, the bread price fixing company, will buy their freezers for them. What's going to happen when it does? What the heck are we doing with that kind of stuff when people are lining up at the food banks? I think there needs to be some responsibility, corporate responsibility, for dealing with food banks and helping us alleviate the actual need for them at some point. But when we have corporations that are literally fixing the price of bread for years and years, and then we give them government subsidies, I just don't get it. It's just the wrong message. And this is why people will, they start looking for scapegoats. All these people are single. They don't deserve help. They need to eat. They're here. I'm sorry.
But Keith, I was just going to go there in terms of corporations, because John, I get what you're saying in terms of the analysis of all the interconnected programs. I get that. But if someone can't eat today, they need to have access to food. So, in terms of policies, what do we do about that? And, so when we were in government, we raised the minimum wage. We were going to raise it again if we'd been elected in 2018. That increase didn't come in. And so, we would have been farther ahead if that had, the wage that's being paid as a minimum wage now, as Keith has said, is not a living wage in Toronto. It's not a living wage probably in most parts of the province. So we're not there. So that's one issue. And if corporations don't work with government on that, if they resist at every turn, as they did when we increased the minimum wage, and it's Keith, it's interesting you use Loblaw as the example. It was Galen Weston who, was furious at us because we raised the minimum wage. And then when the increase was put in place, the premium was put in place during COVID, it was Galen Weston, it was Loblaws who removed that premium for cashiers first. So, there is a real problem with corporate responsibility in terms of paying a living wage. And it's not just the grocery industry, but it's across the board, people paying a living wage for the people who employ them. So this isn't, to my mind, all about government subsidizing. It is also about corporate responsibility. And I don't even think we're having that conversation now, quite frankly.
Well, here's the other part of this. And, we've thrown this number around often over the last 5 years, and I can't imagine what the number is now. But pre-COVID in Ontario, the number was $30 billion. That was the cost of poverty annually across the country. It was $80 billion. But to John's point, Kathleen, the issue here is that there are so many interacting agencies and ministries and services, that they're all kind of doing their own well-intended work, that they do so with blinders on, unintentionally, clearly, but inefficiently around the whole issue of how do we make this, not be such an expense? How can we afford poverty, basically? So we don't have one throat to choke on this. And that's a difficult thing to do, but it's kind of where we need to go.
Well, except, yeah, I mean, but I think just naming that and saying, look, you guys need to all sit down together, because when we say it's not about throwing money at the problem, no, it's not, but it is about making sure money gets into the hands of the people who need it. When we were doing the background on the minimum, on the basic income, there were lots of people who were willing to say, well, it's not just about the amount of money, it's about the other programs. Actually, it's about whether people have the money to buy a winter coat. Actually, it's about whether they can put their truck on the road and run their business. And that is about the actual amount of money they have on a monthly basis. So if all these programs that are uncoordinated are keeping that money out of the hands of people who actually need it, then that coordination needs to happen.
Yeah, and we can't even coordinate our response to Donald Trump. So I'm not sure how we're going to be able to work this one out.
Well, yeah, the idea that we're going to somehow be able to, pull the thread through and make it all work is maybe a little fancy. But I think back to this whole issue around, what are the priorities of government of the day? And this isn't just about the Ford government. The federal government, John, has just been as lame on some of this as any other government, because you look at the Canada Disability Benefit, and we're going to make sure we draw 1 million Canadians out of poverty by doing this, and it was performative and in fact probably inefficient in the way they've rolled it out and the money that's being spent.
Yeah, I can't speak to the specifics on it, Dave. All I know is that federally the Liberal government spent billions of dollars through CERB and continue to promise everything from new homemakers who are likely to get money out of this budget, or people who work in supporting people in their home. I just want to say that is different than home workers. To tons of support programs ranging from EI to other things, that cost the country a lot of money. I can't say that they've abandoned the field, not looking to try and help people. And the same does exist collectively across the country. I guess, again, I want to go back to this and say the root of this really is not just for food banks to be calling this as an important issue, but they need other voices who are not in that area, or that, if we call it a sector, to be speaking out on their behalf and with them. And that's something you just don't hear. I mean, and maybe it's the case that it's taken up nowadays by people who are being laid off at automobile companies, and that they are going to need that kind of support, or it's just that it's among a cacophony of others who are calling out for governments to do things. But the reality is that we're in a situation where the economy is in great peril. Howard Lutnick basically said to a room full of people at the Eurasia BMO conference, good luck to that auto sector, because we're taking it all south of the border. If that's the case, then this is going to take more than trying to figure out, whether we can support food banks. It's going to be a restructuring of our economy, and there's going to be a lot of casualties over the next number of years in this area.
Okay, well, as we said, things may change by the time you hear this, but I'm going to make two predictions by the time we meet next. The World Series will be won in Toronto. And two, there will be a World Series parade before we meet next. So let's just hope that we're all bitching about the traffic in downtown Toronto, just so we can have something to cheer about. So good discussion. Thanks for this. That's a great week. Keith Leslie, Kathleen Wynne, John Wright. I'm Dave Trafford, and we'll be back at it again next week. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the channel. If you're listening on the apps, follow us. Feel free to share it. And if you've got something to say, You can always leave a comment on the feeds, particularly on YouTube. We're starting to get some really interesting comments on YouTube. So what we're going to do is probably make a collection of them, and then we'll just sort of throw them back at the roundtable in future shows, just to see how they manage to stick handle some of the questions, the commentary, and the impressions of what's going on here. But otherwise, no matter where you listen, no matter where you watch, thanks for joining us. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. I'm Dave Trafford.
Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.